So let's start off with a question as we address the biology of trauma. What happens when a car backfires? What do people do when there's that loud bang from an exhaust? Is that what everybody said? Was that what you were thinking? So why is that an important question? What exactly is going on here? Well, everybody hits the floor, don't they? There's that loud bang and everybody suddenly reacts. And it's only then people go, oh, it's just a car backfiring. It wasn't a gun going off or it wasn't something loud hitting the floor. It was just a car backfiring. And why that's important and what that shows us is that there are two parts of the brain which are activating there. There's the part that makes us hit the floor, and actually that happens much more quickly, doesn't it, than the part that then recognises what's going on. The part that remembers the sound and then is able to identify it as it's just a car exhaust. So these two parts of the brain are hugely relevant when it comes to understanding trauma. And let's put this to a diagram so that we can see what we're talking about. And the part that reacts to the bang, the part that makes us hit the floor, is right at the bottom here. It's the animal brain, or as is sometimes called, the reptilian brain. And its responsibility is for agitation, or arousal it's sometimes called. And as you can see, it sits right at the brain stem, and that means that it can send messages to the rest of the body really quickly and is responsible for the fight and flight reflex. So it sends messages that does all of the things that we know about when we're anxious. So our heart rate increases, our blood pressure increases, adrenaline is freed up, and that sends glucose to the muscles. We might experience butterflies in the stomach. We might experience an alteration of breathing as we try and get more oxygen to supply those muscles. This is the animal brain's job. It keeps us safe. It helps us survive by actually doing that reaction, by giving a fight or flight reaction. There are other reactions and I'll talk about those later. Now at the top of the diagram we've got the cortex, or as it's sometimes called, the modern brain or the human brain, or as I like to think of it, the grey wobbly stuff, that kind of thing that's curled over itself in an effort of evolution to give us all the more surface area with which to think. And that's what it's responsible for. It's responsible for the higher cognitive processes. And what that means in effect is the complicated stuff. So mathematics, symbolic constructs like God, like political references, like ideas of ourselves and our own identities, our capacity to think about other people and their identities and relationships and things like that. Why it's important in trauma is this is the bit that's responsible for processing. This is the bit that actually sifts through information and puts a time tag on it and then actually makes long-term memories from it. So this is why the modern brain is important here. This is the bit that it needs safety in order for it to concentrate, so that it's able to process information, which, as we've already seen from the cognitive model, becomes disturbed in traumatic circumstances. So the final part in this three-part brain model is the mammalian brain. It's the part we've spoken less about, and indeed it's perhaps the part I'm going to emphasise less. What it does is take that agitation from the animal brain and convert it into the emotions we experience: anger, fear, love, hate, happiness, that kind of thing. And it's important to us because it forms a conduit by which the modern brain speaks to the animal brain. The animal brain doesn't understand language. We can't communicate it with it directly. We can't tell ourselves not to digest a sandwich once we've swallowed it. And in this regard, when talking to anxiety, we need to communicate in different ways. And those ways that pass through the mammalian brain are largely behavioural means, so stuff that we do, and also stuff that we can see, stuff that we can visualise. And we're going to be using these two principles to be able to do something about the symptoms related to trauma and the way that the animal brain activates within it. So most people can tell you that there are more structures to the brain, that there are more areas of the brain, and this is entirely true. However, the three-part model, or the Triune Brain Model, more than serves our purposes in thinking about what happens in the brain in trauma, and actually maps on to our cognitive model of trauma really quite well. So when we think about the belief part or the meaning part, that's a cortical function. So actually, ideas that we've made of the trauma, ourselves during or afterwards, the role of other people within it, ideas of our future after it, are all parts that's held within the cortex. It has done the processing of that event or derived meaning from the event and is actually seeing things from that perspective. Usually, as we've seen, it would be the cortex which processes these memories, the memories in the cognitive model. But we know that they're unprocessed memories. Parts have been processed, parts haven't. And because of that, they kind of float around. And they tend to float around more to the animal brain than anywhere else. So that when the animal brain sees a threat, it calls upon those memories really quickly. It remembers them. And indeed, it's the animal brain which is responsible for the hypervigilance. That's the fear, anger, shame, disgust, whatever it might be, that the animal brain continues to generate the agitation or arousal for to the rest of the body. So there's that felt sense of discomfort or being on edge or on guard, which comes when we have an unprocessed memory there, and indeed comes when we hold hurt beliefs about ourselves. So it's the animal brain which is also giving the energy off that hypervigilance. So what do? We cope, don't we? And part of this is going to be from the animal brain and unconscious, and part of it is going to be from the cortex, the modern brain, and is going to be a decision-making process. So some trauma responses are instinctual. We don't decide, we don't have a choice in waking up from a nightmare. That's our animal brain activating as during a dream, during a nightmare, the cortex is trying to process. It activates our fight and flight and wakes us up. We can't choose, our animal brain chooses for us to feel the way we did at the trauma when we have a flashback or an intrusive memory. It activates, and with it, it brings all of the senses that we experienced at the time. We might smell the same things, we might hear the same things, we might see the same things. So part of our response is instinctual, part of it comes from the animal brain. Now what happens is, as the cortex tries to process, the memory, that unprocessed memory, comes up. And as the unprocessed memory comes up, the animal brain wakes up. It experiences that it's happening all over again and activates the fight and flight system, along with all the sensory information which came with that trauma, which hasn't been stored the way that usual memories do. This takes away from the concentration we need to process things, or the modern brain needs to process things, and that disrupts that process. We're not able to add that time tag with the animal brain so active. It's narrowed the perception again. It's taken away the concentration, the energy, in an effort to save us, in an effort that fight and flight will prevail. So this is where things loop round. The animal brains and conscious coping and resistance to processing the memories brings us back to the memory itself and it remaining unprocessed, and probably informs at another level the belief and meaning we derive from it. I'm not getting over this trauma isn't going away, am I going mad, I don't have a future without these symptoms, etc., etc. And as we can see from the cognitive model, these then inform our sense of hypervigilance, and the process starts all over again. So this is two differently evolved parts of the brain in conflict. You must remember that the animal brain is the part of the brain that we share with reptilians. It's several millions of years older than the modern brain, the cortex. In this regard, it hasn't caught up yet with our higher processing capacities, and in many ways maybe it shouldn't, because indeed as people we may always need to be on guard and ensure our safety for lots of different things, and the speed of the animal brain is what makes it so effective in this regard. This looping, this very biological looping between animal brain and modern brain, as represented on the Ehlers and Clark model, is very, very frequently witnessed with people who've experienced trauma. Things feel like they're caught on a loop. Everything goes back to the trauma. The trauma or its memory just keeps on coming around, and people often experience as if they're on a broken record. And I really hope this video demonstrates that there are good, sound biological reasons for this. I really hope you've enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe for more.